Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the first Public Funds Public Schools webinar of the new school year. I'm Jessica Levin. I'm an attorney at Education Law Center and the director of Public Funds Public Schools, which is a national campaign led by ELC to ensure that public funds for education are used to support and strengthen public schools and are not diverted to private school vouchers or similar programs. Today's webinar is Federal Vouchers, Funding Cuts, Firings, What You Need to Know About the Impact on Public Schools. And events at the federal level that affect our public schools are certainly on everybody's mind today and in recent months. And we have a fantastic panel here today to discuss them. You'll hear more about them shortly, and there'll be plenty of time for Q&A. A reminder to please drop your questions in the Q&A box, not the chat, and we will see them on the panel. It's now my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Tamerlin Godley. She is a litigation partner in the Los Angeles office of the law firm Paul Hastings, and she is also a co-founder of Public Funds Public Schools. We're deeply grateful for her tireless advocacy for public education. Tammy, take it away.
Welcome. We are so glad that you're here. I don't need to tell you this, we live in challenging times, and I cannot, and maybe you cannot, follow the news always in real time since so much of it is concerning. I try to step back and figure out what is intended for spectacle and what is substantive. When I'm not doing education work, I do entertainment and media litigation, and I do some work with reality television. And some days I feel like we've, against our will, all been cast in a reality television show. But in truly, whether we've asked for it or not, just being alive and caring about justice in this moment, we have been called to stand for public education. And that calling is something that motivates me and energizes me. This webinar is intended to make sure you are fully up to speed on the federal government developments since January 2025, so that we all can respond to this important calling. We are very fortunate to have two distinguished panelists that will give us an overview of what has happened to date and some thinking and analysis and background on all of that. There will be questions that I'll have for them and they may have for each other, but we welcome your questions in the Q&A as we're going along. And we hope that it is a lively and interactive session. So let me introduce our panelists. First, we have Kevin Welner, is a professor emeritus of education policy at the University of Colorado Boulder School of Education. And by courtesy, he also teaches at the School of Law. He's also the director of the National Education Policy Center, housed at CU Boulder, which works to build bridges between the research world and the broader public. Dr. Welner teaches courses in education policy, program evaluation, school law, and social foundations for education. He's received multiple awards for his writing and research from numerous organizations, including the American Educational Research Association, and has been named a fellow of that organization. So a tremendous thinker of our generation on all these topics, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing from Dr. Welner, which I may also call Kevin during the course of this, since I do know him personally. I'd also like to welcome Bethany Little, as she is a managing principal at EducationCounsel, LLC, where she supports foundations, nonprofit organizations, states, districts, and institutions of higher education to drive systems change for equity and advance improvements in education outcomes from early childhood through higher education. Little has spent 20 years working in government and as an advocate, including on the White House Domestic Policy Council and at the U.S. Department of Education. In the U.S. Senate, she served as Chief Education Counsel to the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee under two chairmen, Senators Edward Kennedy and Tom Harkin, and as a legislative aide to Senator Patty Murray. In the nonprofit arena, Little was a managing partner at America Achieves, the vice president for policy and advocacy at the Alliance for Excellent Education, and the director of government relations for the Children's Defense Fund. She currently serves on the boards of the National Equity Project, Veterans Education Success, and Cesar Chavez Public Charter Schools for Public Policy. So we're very glad to welcome Bethany as well. And so with that, why don't we get started with Bethany and give us an overview of what has been happening.
Thanks so much for the opportunity, Tammy. It's great to be with you and all of our many colleagues around the country who are in this work together. I'm going to share a few slides, and while I pull them up, let me just name a few things about what I'm going to say. I'm going to try to describe a very complex agenda very quickly, and so I'll probably talk fast. Happy to answer questions if folks have them. But also I'm going to say some things that are very painful, that can be triggering for folks, that speak about what's happening to real communities and to real people. And so please don't take the fact that I'm talking about them quickly or lightly as the fact that we don't understand the impact of these issues that I'm naming. And I invite you to also take a deep breath, because you're about to go down a bit of a road with me on what's happening from the federal education level. One thing just to keep in mind is some perspective on this agenda, where it's gotten to and in how long. We are 266 days into the Trump administration, not yet a year. There have been 209 executive orders issued. That is more than in all of the Obama and Biden terms, and more than almost any president outside of wartime. There have also been a lot of legal actions filed against the administration and the things that they are doing, and many of those are making their way through the courts. And if you can see there are more of those than there are of the others. So that's worth keeping in mind as well. Given the enormous number of executive actions that I mentioned, 209, and that's executive orders, that doesn't even take into account things like enforcement actions or things that they do up on Capitol Hill, the president's budget proposal. Those are also things that are happening. Those are just executive orders that I named. Given that enormous number of things that have happened in a very short number of days, it can be overwhelming to try to take in what exactly is going on and how is it being done. And so we put together this sort of set of 10 things. This is not us naming what we think the Trump administration is doing. This is the Trump administration telling us quite clearly what it's doing. Often you can find quotes and other things that make this very clear. But certainly we can see in the actions themselves how the Trump administration is working to eliminate the U.S. Department of Education, minimize the federal role, and I have in quotations, return education to the states. I have it in quotations because I think it's quite arguable in a world where states can't choose, for example, what kind of bathroom their students will use, to say that they are somehow being made more in charge of education, and to remember that education has always been the purview of states. States are the entities with the constitutional responsibility and 90% of the funding that drives education. Quite clearly, an interest to reduce funding for public education and other social goods, things like the Medicaid and SNAP cuts that were enacted through the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, or the OBA. Shifting public funds to private schools. That's obviously one of the things we're going to dive more deeply into today. I look forward to talking that through when Kevin's speaking as well. Dismantling what they call DEIA, but I call diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. And I think it's important to say the words of what this is. And reversing civil rights enforcement. What do we mean by that? For years, civil rights enforcement has been used to ensure the civil rights of populations that have been marginalized or denied opportunity in the United States. The Trump administration has said quite explicitly that it expects to use the Office of Civil Rights to make sure that white people, and it also names Asian people frequently, are not getting their civil rights violated, and not to look into the concerns of other populations. Reversing gender equity rights. Those are moves against transgender students, but also against LGBTQ plus students and women in some cases. Disrupting higher education. They use that phrase quite frequently, and it's quite accurate as to what they're doing. Marginalizing immigrant students. And that's important to note here that this is all immigrant students and communities. This is not simply those are undocumented. Not that that would make it okay, but important to understand the breadth of the effort involved. Limiting data and research is a big effort by this administration. There is a clear interest in blinding people to what is going on. Absent the facts and the understanding of what's happening, it becomes easier to promote an agenda. And advancing what I'll call there's other select education priorities, and name what a few of those are. I'm going to quickly run through each of these. I'll focus on the ones that are K-12. I will not cover, among the hundreds and hundreds of actions that have been taken, every one of them in each of these categories. Instead, I'll use a few things to illustrate that in all of these categories, for example, you might find an executive order. There was one issued saying, we will take the department through its last and final mission, as they called it, and close down the Department of Education. They've now made good on that promise by firing over half of the staff that work there, and additional firings just this week. We've seen, and last week, we've seen hundreds more people at the Department of Education losing their jobs, and hundreds of people at the Department of Health and Human Services as well. And then they are beginning to transfer some responsibilities to other agencies. So we've seen them trying to move career and technical education, for example, out of the Department of Education over to the Department of Labor. They've talked about moving special education over to the Department of Health and Human Services, which is of great concern to a lot of special education advocates who points out that that somehow makes a disability a condition, a health condition, to be cured, and makes those students patients, as opposed to what it is now, which is a recognition that we have a right and responsibility and opportunity to educate all students, including our students with disabilities. So you can see that moving, happening, is beginning to get underway. Minimizing the role of the federal role in returning to states, they have invited waivers of a great many of the provisions of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, or the Every Student Succeeds Act, called here ESSA. Those are the same bill. A lot of the provisions in that bill do things like ensure that parents get report cards about students' grade level proficiency, ensure that funds are spent in certain ways, that populations receive the dollars that they are promised. Many provisions of accountability in that bill that they've invited to waive. They have talked about appropriating, consolidating and eliminating programs, and they've created a competitive grant priority that says, if a federal grant program is technically open to districts, institutions of higher education, states, and nonprofit organizations, they will prioritize states among those. And so those other entities might lose out in this case, but they are returning education to the states, so they will do that. And just to remember that reducing their capacity, these firings that we mentioned earlier, do increase the demands on state education agencies. So for example, you see some states beginning to undertake their own civil rights enforcement or pass their own civil rights laws. Reducing funding for public education and other social goods. We've had hundreds of millions of dollars in education grants terminated, almost $1 billion at the Institute of Education Sciences and Education Research and Data grants alone. Billions and billions of dollars worth of grants out of NIH and NSF that have been terminated. And then we had $7 billion in funds that were held back in July and then eventually released. Those were, many of them were formula funds to states, and there was a pretty significant outcry since those were funds that people were expecting in their budget in that moment. We've seen a request for a budget cut of 15% or $12 billion at the U.S. Department of Education that the House of Representatives seems to be willing to take them up on. And so big funding cut could come that way. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act has cuts to Medicaid, SNAP, financial aid, among other things. Shifting public funds to private schools, the $1,700 tax credit is definitely the big actor here. And that was what was passed through the OBA. And that's what Kevin will talk more about. So I won't go into details on that, but clearly a massive driver of shifting federal funds to private schools, because they in the end made a change to this tax credit to have it uncapped as an overall total. It's a capped from the individual, but not for the overall total. This could very quickly become the single largest federal funding stream in public education. So to say that again, the single largest federal funding stream supporting education could be going to private schools. They've named choice as a U.S. Department of Education grant priority. I mentioned grant priorities earlier. That means they can designate certain things as being prioritized in competitive grants. I mentioned states earlier. Another that they've said is they will try to look for programs that will advance choice and give those a priority in competitive grants going forward. And that's an example here is where they've moved some money away from some existing programs and towards the federal charter school grants in last year's funds. So this is funding that was already allocated to other programs, moved to the federal charter schools program. There has been a massive effort to name diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility work as illegal. First through executive orders, but with follow-on guidance and enforcement actions. It's quite striking to undertake something of this magnitude, in part because there's nothing the Department of Education can do to actually make efforts to make our education system more diverse, more equitable, more inclusive, and more accessible illegal. They can't change the underlying law. However, their efforts on this front have been nothing short of quite impressive, if you want to use that word. And they've undertaken enforcement and guidance, sent letters out to the field that have people across the country, from early childhood through K-12 into higher education, voluntarily pulling back their legal efforts to promote diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. So the chilling effect of that has been enormous. They tried to do a guidance and certification requirement on Title VI compliance and the Students for Fair Admissions Act. The Students for Fair Admissions, SFFA reference there was the affirmative action case decided by the Supreme Court 2 years ago. That has been stayed by the court. So that is not, in fact, in place right now, but more executive actions on things like disparate impact, which is how we know whether or not a policy may have a racist or otherwise discriminatory impact, even if its intent may not be that. And again, as I mentioned, using their enforcement and other investigative authorities to go after institutions of higher education, K-12, and early childhood institutions where they're saying they think these folks are breaking the law and they are going to enforce their version of civil rights. Executive order on the fact that there are only two sex or two genders, male and female, and that there should be no ability of anybody in one gender to use the sports team, bathroom, or locker room of another. They created a whole task force across all of the agencies, a multi-agency task force for Title IX enforcement against transgender students. And what I mean by that is they are looking at programs, for example, in the Department of Energy that might be education programs and saying, we may not be able to take away your education money without going through a whole process that's regulated by the Department of Education, but we could take away these grants that you've gotten through other agencies through our Title IX task force, and they are not subject to those same enforcement requirements of the Office of Civil Rights. And so again, using every tool in the toolbox. FERPA is a good example of that. FERPA is the Federal Education Right to Privacy Act. It has broad authority under it. It's very, very old and it's very, very short. And it basically says it has governs what kind of data the feds can collect and share about students. And their task force is looking at how can they use that to enforce their gender equity view. And then they are already taking actions against 5 Northern Virginia districts that are have transgender bathrooms in place because those Northern Virginia districts are actually following a Fourth Circuit court decision that's been in place for years now, the Gavin Grimm case, which requires them to have transgender bathrooms in place. And yet the Department of Education is now withholding funds from those districts, saying they cannot do that. So again, more things that will play out in the courts. I won't go into the disruption of higher education because we're focused on K-12 here, but many of you have to be aware of this, including the most recent compact that they put out there saying if you follow our rules and our preferences, we will give you extra access to money. So a different type of extortion. There is an enormous effort to marginalize immigrant students and communities. The appearance of ICE agents at schools, the reversal of long-standing prohibitions where we did not enforce our immigration laws on school property in order to avoid discouraging people from coming to school. And yet it's very clearly an effort to discourage people. Denying benefits to non-citizens. What do I mean by that? For example, there's an effort to say students who are getting CTE may be getting some of that outside of the regular K through 12 system. They might be getting it through, for example, an institution of higher education. And so while the Plyler v. Doe requirement Supreme Court case entitles all students in the United States to a K-12 education, regardless of their status on immigration, they are saying if you're getting anything outside of that, we're going to chip away at that and not give that to you. They have also this executive order on English as the official national language and birthright citizenship. The official national language piece is really going after the degree to which we have things translated and accessible to different communities in different languages by the federal government. Many, many things that could be impacted over time there. Limit data and research, I mentioned earlier, over $1 billion, almost $1 billion, not over, almost $1 billion in cuts through the Institute for Education Sciences, or the R&D arm of the Department of Education. There have been many data collections that have been stopped, interrupted, narrowed down. They've put out things saying that they, for example, an executive order on accreditation saying they will no longer allow the disaggregation of data so that you can't see sort of which students are impacted by which policies. And then there's talk of re-envisioning the Institute of Education of Sciences, but 90% of the staff that works inside the Institute of Education Sciences has been cut. There's almost nobody there anymore. They recently put out a grant-making executive order that said that they would look at all grants with a new lens on whether or not those grants not only were approved through a peer review process, but also met the administration's political interests. And they would use that in making those grant-making decisions. Finally, it's important to recognize they have expressed some other priorities as well. They talk about the workforce and AI as big ones that you hear them speak quite a bit about. They have their Religious Liberty Commission to root out anti-Christian bias. They've gone after COVID vaccine mandates in schools. So some other priorities outside of where I've talked about. The last thing I'll say before I leave is that don't let this sort of parade of horribles get you too down. We have seen things changing. In the beginning, all of this happening was like all of us being deer in headlights, unclear what to do or where to go. But we are beginning to see people come out from the bushes to find leadership, to find safety in numbers and collective action. And you all are among those folks doing that work. So thank you for that. And I hope this was helpful.
Thank you, Bethany. That was a terrific summary of but overall, the agenda and different actions that have been taken. Terrific. Thank you. Kevin, can you talk with us about the federal voucher program?
Yes, I'd be happy to. Thank you so much, Bethany. That was impressive. Obviously, we could have spent more than an hour on each one of those 10. And so to give that overview that quickly is exhausting, but impressive. So thanks, Tammy. Thanks, everyone, for being here. Thanks to the Education Law Center and Public Funds, Public Schools. I do not have slides. I'm just going to speak extemporaneously about the part of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act that is generally referred to as a school choice provision. I'm going to problematize that a little bit as I walk through this, but it is really important to understand that it was put in there specifically to get public money into private schools, to fund private school tuition. How it plays out, as I'll explain, is still very much up in the air. But let me walk through that, and then if we have a little bit of time, I'd like to return to a couple things that are going on right now, in particular the new layoffs. I think should be stressed in terms of what we could be doing right now, those deers coming out of the bushes. I think there's an opportunity right now for us to step forward, particularly with regard to some layoffs in the Department of Education. Okay, so the Reconciliation Act, or the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, includes this provision that was initially put in there based on some statutory language that had been around for a number of years that the Senate parliamentarian rejected at the last minute. This was all very rushed, if you recall. And so overnight, we got new language. And it's a bit sketchy. It's fairly short. It's confusing at times. But I could walk through the main ideas and then talk about what some of the holes and questions are. So as Bethany mentioned, there's a $1,700 tax credit for individuals. That means that if you owe $1,700 or anything up to $1,700 in your federal individual taxes, you can pay that money instead. You could give it to a new organization, a nonprofit called a Scholarship Granting Organization, or SGO. SGOs then receive your donation and the donations of others, can pool that money. can take 10% off the top to feather their own beds and pay for administration, and then hand that money out to for eligible educational expenses to students. Now, there are a few interesting parts to this. One is that it's not the federal government, this is a brand new thing. There is no existing way that the federal government prefers a given nonprofit as a recipient of donations. Right now, if I give a donation to a charitable organization, I can take a deduction. And there is no place where I could donate money and get a tax credit, let alone, as in this case, 100% tax credit, which basically says I get to move my money out of the federal bucket, the normal money that goes into the federal government, and I can move it over to a chosen scholarship granting organization. So that's one thing to note. Another is that one of the things that happened in that last minute overnight change is that this became a program that states can choose to opt into or not opt into. And that opt-in choice can be made annually. So my home state of Colorado can choose to not opt in when the program starts in January 1st of 2027, but then 2 or 3 years later can choose to opt in under this law, right? So every year there's a new choice. Same thing, like Arkansas might choose to opt in as of this year, and then 2 years down the line decide not to opt in, or to opt out, I should say. So that's one thing. If you opt in, then you need to go through this process of designating SGOs, scholarship granting organizations, that would be able to receive this funding. It seems like, but again, this is a whole, it's unclear. It seems like if I want to donate to a scholarship granting organization in Utah or New York, if they choose to opt in, I can do that and get my tax credit. I could only do it once, right? I only get a total of $1,700 maximum, but I could choose which state to donate my money to. We know from prior research of states that have similar laws that we tend to donate to the SGO type of organization that serves our own kids or our own neighborhoods or our relatives' kids or friends' kids, which, as you could imagine, in terms of who owes this money, leads to a rich get richer problem. That you're more likely, if you're a school serving a wealthy area, to get these donations to a SGO serving your community. So that's a very brief idea of how it initially is set up. Right now, 3 governors have already announced that they will not opt their states in. Wisconsin, New Mexico, and Oregon, if I'm remembering right. And a lot of states are still saying we are considering what to do. The main reason to be considering what to do right now are those holes I spoke about, the questions about what the program is really going to look like. And the statute is set up so that the Department of Treasury, Donald Trump's Department of Treasury, gets to make the rules. And we are waiting to see the draft rules. Bethany probably has a better feel for this than I do, but I've heard that we're waiting until the spring, most likely, before we see those draft rules. So when those draft rules come out, the main thing that I would be looking for, if I'm one of these governors waiting on the sidelines to see whether they want to participate. By the way, I think they shouldn't under any circumstances. I think those 3 states made the right decision. I think this is really problematic for reasons that I think we should discuss. But even setting aside the broad yes or no, there's this question of, if I opt in, what sort of conditions should I place on that opt-in? Under what conditions, under what circumstances would it be okay for me to bring my state into this program? And when it was initially passed, a lot of supporters of vouchers and a lot of supporters of legislation said, oh, this is going to be so flexible. States are going to be able to design this however they want their states to work. I don't expect that to be the case. I expect this Treasury Department to be designing rules that will push for unregulated vouchers. So let me back up for 1 second and explain the way that these SGOs are set up in the rules. An eligible educational expense is defined in the law as an expense that is among the Coverdale account categories. This is a pre-existing law that some of you in the audience might be familiar with the Coverdale accounts, but it sets forth different categories of expenses that are okay to use Coverdale money on. One of those, which is a change made in the first Trump administration, one of those Coverdale accounts is to pay for private school tuition. But there are other categories as well: books, computers, transportation, after-school programs, internet connectivity and resources, and then tutoring, which I think is a particularly interesting one. So those other accounts, some public school advocates have pointed to that and said, hey, look, you can opt in, and then we could support our public school students, or all of our students, not just those going to private schools, by donating to SGOs and having them give money for educational expenses that help all students. As a practical matter, as I mentioned, the reason why this thing was put into law is because advocates for private school tuition, advocates for public money going to private school tuition or vouchers, wanted this to be in law. And the main thing that we're seeing in terms of advocates, in terms of money behind this, is money to create voucher programs throughout the nation and to expand voucher programs throughout the nation. In lots of states, mine included Colorado, voters have already rejected vouchers. In Colorado, we've rejected them 3 times. California's rejected vouchers twice, for example. These states don't have voucher programs. But the hope of the people who pushed this law through is that the enticement of the SGO money would bring these states into that voucher category. So the resistant states that have said, no, we don't want to privatize public education, we want to prioritize our public schools, that these states are going to be pushed as a political and fiscal push to join the ranks of states with vouchers. But there's this real question about flexibility in the Treasury Department regulations that I mentioned. If those Treasury Department regulations give states the flexibility, then hypothetically, California, Colorado, New York, Massachusetts, places that don't have vouchers can say, oh, okay, we'll participate, but we want to participate in a way that's consistent with what our voters have said they want and what we think is important for our state's values. We are going to set up this program to have SGOs only eligible to have SGO money only eligible for some Coverdale categories. So I mentioned tuitioning. There's a great body of research, some of which came out of the pandemic era, about the potential for high dosage, high quality tutoring. That tutoring could be provided for every student, whether you're homeschooled, in private school, in public school. It could reach everyone in the state. And it could be regulated and structured in a way that meets the requirements for high quality programs pursuant to the research I just mentioned. So the potential for that depends on whether or not the regulations, Treasury Department regulations, allow that. Another question is, we know that when a student moves from public to private school taking a voucher, they lose a lot of their rights. They lose IDEA protections, they lose a lot of anti-discrimination civil rights protections. When that happens, students are put at risk. So a state might very well say, the only way we'll participate in this is if we can include a variety of anti-discrimination protections. I refer to this as the European model. A lot of European countries provide public money for private schools, but do so in a way that makes those private schools much more public, right? Much more protected in terms of the quality of education, the professionalization of their teaching force, etc. How am I doing on time, Tammy? Am I okay? All right. So one of the other things to note is that the research on vouchers the research that we have on existing voucher programs is, one, extremely hamstrung by the laws that are passed because they don't allow the data to be collected to actually see how the voucher programs are doing. And two, we have a few states that have allowed those data, and when we analyze them, it is devastating. When a student takes money to go from public school to private school, takes this voucher money, the damage done to their educational outcomes is comparable to the so there are three places. Let me back up. Three places where we have these data that we have these devastating outcomes, and in all three of them, there are four places. There's Washington, D.C., which is a bit of a wash, just slightly negative outcomes. But in the other three, in Louisiana, in Ohio, and in Indiana, what we see are very, very negative outcomes, particularly for math. So students lose 0.4 standard deviations, which you could think of as the same level of devastation that we saw from the COVID pandemic. So we're talking major, major damage. We also see issues of access. So questions of which students are admitted into the private schools. We see questions of who takes advantage of it. What we tend to see is the students already going to private schools are the ones who then snap up the vouchers and say, thank you, government, for subsidizing what I was already going to do. And we're seeing evidence that tuition hikes come with that. So in other words, because the parent can take in this public subsidy, they can afford to pay more, which means the private schools charge more. So what we're doing is just this massive shift, and as Bethany mentioned, this could get into $20 billion a year, which is more than Title I, more than IDEA. We're talking a huge amount of money shifting to subsidize people to go to private school. And as I said, even when it succeeds in moving kids from public to private school, we're seeing a harm. And that's largely because of the quality of the schools that are popping up in these vouchers states to receive and take in the public money. Okay. I think what I want to do actually, Bethany, because like I said, I'm speaking extemporaneously. Have I skipped over anything about this that you think we should cover before moving on?
No, I think you've given a great 101 along with a lot of insights.
Okay. Thank you. Let me stop there and get back to the discussion then.
Thank you, Kevin. And we'll all remember to unmute even this many years into our lives on webinars. So we had a question from the audience, Kevin, that I wanted to have you answer. And they said, if your state already has voucher programs or already has federal tax or state tax credits, state tax credit vouchers, are you automatically opted into this, or is it still that everybody has to opt in or opt out?
No, so you're not opted in. You're not opted in automatically. Even states like Colorado that don't have a voucher policy do have organizations very akin to these SGOs, and they are already pushing to get the states participating so they can start bringing in the money. But if you're in a state like Pennsylvania, as an example, Pennsylvania has a policy that is comparable in some ways. But that policy was adopted during a prior governor's era, and the current governor may decide, Josh Shapiro, may decide not to opt in. And that is a choice that, again, it's a little unclear who makes the decision, but generally speaking, we're defaulting to the governor. And it really will be a choice that, as I say, can be made each year and be made by each state individually, whether or not they currently have a program.
And Kevin, just to make sure we understand the timeline. So right now we're waiting for the Treasury Department to put out regulations, which will come out at some point. I assume there'll be like a chance for comment and the regular things we generally see with that. And at some point, those regulations will go into place. And then the states have to opt in by the end of 26. Is that right?
Yes. So as the program gets moving, the decision has to be made, I think, before the beginning of the next year. So sometime in that year.
Bethany, you were shaking your head. Do you have a better sense on the timing?
Oh, no, not better. Just to say, a state can opt in at any point. At any point, you could pass on it the first year, and later on, if your state changes its mind, they could opt in. The first tax year for which you can have your deduction become I want to say reimbursable. That's not the right word. But you get your deduction back would be, as Kevin said, the 2026 tax year will be the first year that will happen for states that opt in that at that point. But if a state didn't opt in, then they could opt in later.
Is it 2026 or 2027?
It's 2026 taxes, I believe. For the 2027, you'd be paying them in April of 2027.
Yeah.
Okay. Because okay. We'll
So the program starts in terms of the SGOs handing out the money. It starts on January 1st of 2027.
Okay. And in terms, so there's going to be a lot of pressure on governors one way or the other between now and the end of this year, depending on whenever these regulations come out. But what are the points for both of you that folks can make within their states to pressure their governors not to opt in to this to the federal tax credit?
So I wrote a policy memo that came out, I think, last week. I don't know if we've been able to post it. It looks like it was posted earlier in the chat. The one that says nepc.colorado.edu/publication/vouchers. It's a little bit up on the chat. And what I argue and it gets specifically to your question, Tammy, what I argue is that let's not be naive about what the Trump Treasury Department regulations are going to look like. They are not going to give governors and states the flexibility to design programs that are consistent with their state's values and support of public education, if that is indeed what the state values. So if you're a governor who cares about equity and access and public schools and public school students that are strong and supported, and is concerned about the types of discrimination that could take place in publicly supported private schools, and the quality issues that I mentioned and the access issues, then don't opt in because you're basically accepting a Trojan horse through the fence, through the gates. This is not a policy that was passed to benefit your public schools. It was passed to get vouchers into your state to further privatize your schools. And I think it's important, there's a lot of this idea that, well, this is free money. We have to take free money, right? It's not free money. First of all, there's no such thing as free money. But if you think about what happens when you create a parallel system and move kids out of the public school and system into the private school system, you're creating a cycle of decline that we see, particularly in other countries that have had vouchers around for longer. You see political support for public schools decrease. You see fiscal support in terms of bond elections and things like that decrease. You see kids who moved out and wanted to go to private schools using this money being sent back to the public schools if the private schools have any sort of issues with the way they're doing academically or discipline or something like that. You see issues of the costs of that movement, but also the stratification that takes place, right? So if the public schools are serving students who are more expensive to educate, that puts a bigger burden on the public school system. And if you have one sector that is going by a set of rules that allows them to discriminate and to select among students and deny access and kick students out, and another that's trying to be inclusive to everyone, you have a very unequal playing field, and that plays out in ways that are harmful in the short term, but certainly in the long term. So no, it's not free money, even setting that aside. And as I mentioned, you end up with an allocation of public money based on what wealthier taxpayers want to do with their money, right? So I'm going to support my kid, my community, my kid's school, my relatives or friends' kids' schools. And if you're concerned about the schools that don't have that sort of tax base around them and those sorts of wealthy donors around them, it's particularly a cycle of decline for those communities and those schools.
Bethany, how are your thoughts on either on that question, or I loved your picture of the deer in headlights and then deers coming together, ways that you have seen people rising up in leadership in response to this, and the best ways that we can be standing for public education in this time.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. I agree with all of the challenges, not just challenges, like problems and disasters that Kevin outlined that this kind of voucher program creates for public education for our communities. I think it's horrendous and fought with every fiber of our being against it passing. But I will say I'm less optimistic than Kevin is about the ability of governors to stand strong against this. I think that every state will in the end take this offer. I think that in part because it will be very, very challenging to stand against all sorts of parents who are saying, you're just telling us to send our money to another state, because they can still give their money away. They just give it away in another state. And I think it will be challenging for parents that want to use that money and create scholarship granting organizations for the other types of expenditures that Kevin laid out, like high dosage tutoring and other summer programs and other things that people may want to have these scholarships for. So for a variety of political reasons, I think it is a very tough fight. Not that people shouldn't fight it, but just to name, given how tough it is, I do think standing early and clearly for what you believe should be true about any of these programs that operate within your state. It is true that we may lose a lot of leverage under the Treasury regulations. Kevin's prognostication is probably correct that they will probably not leave a lot of space for there to be regulation by the state around this, by the governor, by their choice of what is a scholarship granting institution organization and what is not. But there are other tools a state could have. For example, any organization operating a nonprofit inside a state needs a state license to operate, and states have varying rules about who can operate and what the accounting, other control, accountability, and other controls are for those. You could see state legislatures take up action to say, to operate as a scholarship granting organization in our state, the following things have to be true. And the following things could be the sorts of things that Kevin describes about, if you're going to give public dollars out in the form of scholarships, you must give them to all students. You cannot discriminate based on any student characteristic or any family characteristic. A lot of times we see in the discrimination with use of vouchers is actually against family who might, for example, be going to a religious school and have two gay parents, and they say, you know, your student can't come here. So students or family discrimination. And so I think it is the time to start being clear about what we believe public dollars should fund in our state and what kinds of things we as a state would stand against, like discrimination against students, like the fact that students won't be able to access their rights to things like an individual education plan if they're a student with a disability inside a private school. This is the time for that. But the second thing I'd say is, because these are likely to exist in almost every state in America, it is also the time to begin to create the strongest possible mechanisms to bring the dollars to public schools themselves, and to create the kinds of programs that would allow people to give to public schools and allow those dollars to go to public school students. So I think you sort of have to be fighting a bit of a two-front war here. On the one hand, doing your best to stop or limit the use of public dollars for private schools inside your state, but on the other hand, having in place a real strategy and plan to maximize the ability of those dollars to be used for the benefit of public school students.
Right. One thing I wanted to clarify is that the donations can't start until January of 27. So all the rules will be in place, and then it's donations in the 2027 tax year. It's then would be a tax credit starting in 2027, just so we have the time frame right. One of the things that I think, I mean, the idea that if I'm giving to my local public school in any number of ways, I get a tax deduction, And if you give that, our federal government said, but if you give money to a private school, you get a tax credit. So instead of paying the government, as Kevin said, you're paying it to the scholarship organization, which then is giving to the private school and supporting those private schools. And to have the federal government put their thumb on the scale in that way, I wonder when people are going to start to say, or how we can help them to see and say that that is not okay, and that's not what we want to do. When you to this day, when you do polling of individuals and you ask them whether they support vouchers, people say no. And the majority of people say no because they don't think that public resources should go to subsidize wealthy people or even moderately wealthy people sending their kids to private school, and that's what this does. There was one of the things you, Kevin, said that you wanted to talk a little bit about things people can do in relation to the firings or the layoffs, and maybe Bethany has some thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, let me quickly respond to a couple things there and then jump into the question you just asked. So I think that the intent of this law is clearly to prioritize money going to these SGOs with private school tuition. Bethany's point that there can be a campaign, a strong push to get people to donate to these same SGOs that are going to focus on public schools. And, I think there are all sorts of problems with that, including the rich get richer problem that I discussed. But imagine the budget busting potential of this law if that actually happened. It would be far, far, far in excess of the amount of money that we currently put into education, the federal government currently puts into education. I'm not optimistic about how much money we'll be able to that campaign would be doing. I think that the people behind this law are probably correct that it's going to end up pushing a lot of money into private schools and not into public. And one of the things that I argue in that memo is that what governors should do to address that political and economic push and the pressure that Bethany's talking about is to get out in front of the Treasury Department regulations. For governors to say right now, tomorrow, before these regulations come out, I will opt in, or first, ideally, I will not opt in. But the other alternative is I will opt in only under these conditions, only if I'm given the flexibility, only if the state is given the flexibility to do these things. So I think that shifts the political pressure a little bit. I think actually potentially quite a bit, and makes it clear what the state's priorities are. And if Treasury then doesn't allow that flexibility, then the answer is, okay, we'll wait until the next Treasury Department, and then maybe we'll opt in. In terms of your question about the new layoffs, so this is in response to the government, or potentially it's connected to the government shutdown, where the administration has said, not only will we have these furloughs, which is typically the case with these shutdowns, but we're going to take the opportunity to just start laying people off, to start firing people. And these new RIFs follow from, let's keep the context here, right? They follow from the retirement incentive departures. That was the first thing the Trump administration did. And then the earlier RIFs that took place. And then obviously these shutdown induced furloughs are also part of it. Roughly 87% of the remaining education department staff has been furloughed. So the first two steps, the retirement incentive departures and the earlier RIFs, already reduced the education department staffing from 4,100 approximately to approximately 2,450. So not quite half, but a huge, huge cut. There were a variety of lawsuits, including one filed by the Education Law Center that we could talk about. But right now, those lawsuits have not been successful because of our Supreme Court. So what we have right now are news reports and reporting that suggests that what Trump has done is he's attempted to lay off another 466 of those 2,450, bringing that the total cuts down to more than half of the department being cut. And what we see is that the departments that are hit are particularly harmful for students with special needs, students with disabilities. And that's on top of earlier cuts to the Office of Civil Rights. And keep in mind, most of the complaints that the Office of Civil Rights addresses are students with disabilities. So cuts to the IES, the research area, they like collected data on who's, including other things, students with special needs. And so if you're a student, a family with a student with disabilities, you're basically on your own right now. What we hear, the Department of Education fired nearly everyone in the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services. That's the office that, among other things, administers IDEA. So the administration essentially wants to send that $15 billion of taxpayer money out without any attempt to provide the capacity, the oversight, the accountability to make sure the money is getting to the schools and doing what it should. There are campaigns, and by the way, that's not the only important cut. The Office of Elementary and Secondary Education, which oversees Title I, has apparently also been essentially zeroed out with employees. So there are petitions right now. There are all sorts of activity to try to reach members of Congress, reach the administration and say, reverse these layoffs. We need these people in DC doing their job, working with states, enforcing these laws, setting aside the fact that it's clearly statutorily required that the Department of Education administer these programs, and they've basically said, no, we're not going to.
Thank you. There's a lot of terrific questions. We're not going to be able to get to all of them. We'll try and do some of those offline. But one of the questions a number of people have asked about the federal tax credit voucher is the understanding that people can direct it to a particular school. So what an SGO has to give to at least 2 schools. But what you can see is like, okay, there's school A and school B. I'm giving it there. I didn't direct it, but let's see, school A and school B are going to get the funds. That's certain to happen. So no, you can't direct it, but there will be SGOs that will be set up for 2 schools, and that's where it will go. So yeah, it's because a bunch of people had questions around that.
And we even have institutions here in the city I live in that are like, it's an elementary school and it feeds almost entirely to 2 high schools. And they're a consortium of 3. And you could say, we're going to work together to raise money from our parents to give to our 3 schools. And so there's very easily, you can see how these are pretty directed in their actual giving.
Bethany, in terms of the things that you think folks can be doing more on the other issues, did you have other things that you wanted to add? We've talked a lot about the federal tax credit voucher, but do you have other things that people can be doing in their states to fill gaps for things that are happening at the federal level?
I think the gap filling is very hard. You're talking about large amounts of money and significant depth of expertise that are being quickly wiped away. What I instead would suggest is that this is the time for people to be sharing the narrative about what is happening, to be helping people to see the signal through the noise, that it's not just 400 individual actions of executive orders and enforcements, it's some very specific goals that are being set out, and to communicate with their governors, their state legislators, and their federal legislators to let them know what about this bothers them? Where do they have concerns? What are they okay with and not okay with? The communication about what's happening both to your community and to your representatives is the most important thing right now. It's the only thing that has a chance of reversing what's happening.
One thing that is at least I'm not sure we'd call this a positive note exactly, but there were all these executive orders that told these various organizations within the federal government to see how they could support school choice. And we've been monitoring those, and largely those have been wallpaper. I mean, there's not anything substantive, and so good. People were watching. We're trying to make sure that was more spectacle than actually something substantive happened, which has been good. Well, I see Jessica is coming back on. We've gotten to the end of our hour. Jessica, you want to finish this up?
Sure. Thank you, Tammy. Yes, unfortunately, we are at the end of our hour. This has been such an informative and insightful discussion about how these federal developments will affect our states, our communities, our individual students. It's a very complicated topic, and you all did a marvelous job of explaining it and guiding us through it. But let's remember the bottom line, which is that public funds should not go to private education, and vouchers are unaccountable, discriminatory, and they undermine the public schools that welcome all students. As Bethany mentioned, states have the constitutional obligation under their own state constitutions to provide adequate education for all students, and that includes many of the things that are potentially uses of the vouchers under the new federal voucher bill, but states already have the obligation to provide those to public students. So let's never give up the fight to advocate for those public education rights and against programs like vouchers that would undermine them. We have lots of resources available to help you in that effort on the PFPS website, including a fact sheet and an FAQ about the federal voucher law. And those resources, as well as a recording of this webinar, will be posted on our advocacy page and also emailed to all of you. If you're not on our general email list, please sign up and contact us if you need support in your public education advocacy. So thank you once again to the wonderful panel and our moderator, Tammy Godley, and everyone behind the scenes at ELC who made this PFPS webinar possible. We look forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks, everybody.